The very first thing that would destroy you before the bad food, before the dubious medicine, before the terrifying politics, is the smell. You step into a medieval street inn, let's say, 14th century London, and within 5 seconds you are already reconsidering every life decision that led you here. There's the thick animal smell from the livestock that live alongside people in many homes and wander freely through market streets. There's the open drain running down the center of most city roads, which serves as the combined sewage, rubbish, and general mystery liquid disposal system for everyone in the neighborhood. There's the smell of unwashed wool, unwashed bodies, and the slightly Swedish background aroma of wood smoke mixing with something that used to be alive and isn't quite anymore. Medieval cities genuinely had an odor so distinctive that travelers wrote home about it. Not impressed, not neutral. They wrote home about it. As a warning. Now, to be fair to medieval people, they weren't oblivious to this. They minded it enormously. They burned herbs, scattered flowers, held little bouquets of lavender under their noses. The wealthy had cedarwood floors and sweet-smelling rushes. They just didn't have the infrastructure to solve it at a city-wide level. There was no sewage treatment, no reliable running water, and no waste management beyond fling it in the direction of the ditch and hope. Here's where it gets slightly more complicated, because the Middle Ages weren't the era of no bathing that popular myth insists on. Wealthy people did wash regularly in carved wooden tubs. Public bathhouses existed in most European cities. The church actually had to pass rules at various points about bathhouses being too popular, which suggests people were using them rather enthusiastically. But 3 things worked against cleanliness for the average person. First, heating water was a significant project. You had to carry it, heat it over the fire in stages, and then coordinate an actual bathing event, which was not a quick shower but a whole domestic undertaking. Second, soap was expensive. Not luxury expensive. Working family budgets genuinely couldn't stretch to it expensive most of the time. And third, everyone around you smelled the same, so the baseline expectation was simply different. You'd walk into a room of 20 medieval peasants and they'd all be breathing normally, because that was just the air. For you, a time traveler from the 21st century, the experience would be profoundly physical. Your nose has never been trained for this. You would smell things within minutes that you have no reference points for. And you'd smell them constantly, because you can't exactly pop back to your hotel for a shower. You're here for the day, remember. You're committed now. Let's talk about toilets because we have to, and because the truth is both worse and more interesting than you might expect. The lucky medieval people, your castle dwellers and monastery inhabitants, had something called a guardrobe. A guardrobe was a small stone room jutting out from the castle wall, with a hole in the seat that dropped straight down the outside of the wall into a pit, a moat, or occasionally just directly onto the ground below. The name guardrobe literally comes from the same word as wardrobe, because clothes were hung there to absorb the fumes, which was believed to kill moths. So medieval fashion-conscious people hung their best tunics next to a drop toilet on purpose for the fumes. This is fashion innovation, medieval style. For everyone else in the city, and there were a lot of everyone else, the system was rather more improvisational. Chamber pots were used at night and emptied in the morning, usually into the street. Many cities had rules about this. Gardes l'eau, watch out for the water, was shouted before the contents went out the window. Most people heeded this warning selectively. Here's where you discover one of medieval history's great underappreciated professions, the gong farmer. Gong farmers were the people whose job it was to empty the communal cesspits, the large pits dug beneath privies that served entire neighborhoods, sometimes for years, until they simply had to be dealt with. They worked at night by lantern light, using buckets and carts. The contents were taken outside the city walls and sold to farmers as fertilizer, which was, honestly, an admirably efficient closed loop. The pay was very good by medieval standards. Good enough that people did it voluntarily and built entire family businesses around it. It was dangerous work. Methane buildup in deep cesspits was a genuine lethal risk, and at least one historical record exists of a Gong farmer who drowned in the pit. Occupational hazard is an understatement. For you wandering around a medieval city for a day, the Gong farmer system is invisible and functional in a grim sort of way. What you experience is just the outcome of the system, the thin layer of everything on every surface, the specific mineral quality of the mud between the cobbles, the way stepping in something unidentified is a regular event that medieval pedestrians navigate with the resigned expertise of long practice. You'd adjust eventually. Humans are remarkably adaptable. But the first hour would be extremely educational. Congratulations. You've survived the smell. You've navigated the streets. And now, bad news, you appear to have a fever. Perhaps you've cut your hand on something, or swallowed something inadvisable, or simply had the misfortune of standing too close to someone with the wrong kind of cough. Either way, you need medical attention. The options available to you in, say, the year 1350 are as follows. You can see a physician if you can afford one, a university-trained man who has studied Galen and Avicenna and will take your pulse, examine your urine, check your astrological chart, and recommend a course of action based on the 4 humors. The humors are blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and all illness is caused by their imbalance. The treatment involves restoring the balance, which usually means removing some of the excess humor, most often by opening a vein and letting some blood out, because blood was almost always considered the culprit. This is called bloodletting, and it was used for roughly everything, from fevers to fractures to sadness. Did it help? Almost never. Did it occasionally kill people who were already struggling? Frequently. Was it performed with complete confidence and a very professional air? Absolutely. If you can't afford a physician, you head to the barber-surgeon. The barber-surgeon is where medieval medicine gets creative. These were trained craftsmen who handled anything involving cutting, haircuts, yes, but also tooth extractions, setting broken bones, amputating limbs when necessary, and treating wounds. The red and white striped pole outside the barber's shop that still exists today. The red is blood. The white is the bandage. It used to spin to indicate that bloodletting was being performed. This is not a metaphor. Tooth extraction in the Middle Ages was a significant event. There was no anesthetic beyond perhaps some wine, a bite of wood, and a firm grip on the armrests. The barber-surgeon had a range of tools with reassuring names like pelican and dental key, medieval instruments designed to grip and lever the tooth free from its socket. Success rates varied. Pain rates did not vary. They were uniform and comprehensive. The truly dedicated medical option was the apothecary, who sold herbs, compounds, and remedies of varying effectiveness. Many herbal preparations were actually sensible. Willow bark for pain, the same compound that would eventually become aspirin, chamomile for digestive discomfort, and various plants with genuine antibiotic or antiseptic properties. The problem was that these worked remedies were sold alongside preparations of powdered horn, ground pearls, and instructions for amulets to wear while reciting specific prayers. The sorting of effective from ineffective was left as an exercise for the patient. If all of that fails, there's the hospital in the medieval world, usually run by a religious order, meaning nuns or monks, and genuinely focused on care rather than cure. Medieval hospitals were more like hospices in our modern sense, places of rest, prayer, and comfort rather than medical intervention. You got a bed. You got regular meals. You got spiritual support. Actual medical treatment was not the primary offering. This sounds damning, but consider. For someone with a chronic condition or recovering from significant injury, consistent rest and food were genuinely life-saving compared to continuing in the world. Medieval hospitals had better survival rates for some conditions than their 19th century counterparts, simply because the 19th century had surgeons performing complex operations in the era just before germ theory, which went poorly. Medieval nuns, by contrast, mostly kept you still, kept you fed, and kept you away from people who wanted to cut you open. The upshot for your single day in the Middle Ages, your health strategy is simple. Do not get sick. Do not get injured. Do not eat anything you can't positively identify. And do not, under any circumstances, mention that you have a headache in earshot of anyone holding a lance. The most difficult thing about a single day in the Middle Ages, more than the smell, more than the dentistry, is that your very presence has a legal status you haven't arranged in advance. In medieval feudal society, where you were born largely determined what you were. And if you were born a serf, a villein as they were formally called, you were not free. Not enslaved in the ancient sense, the church had largely pushed out outright slavery. But unfree. A serf was bound to the land of their lord. They could not leave their village, marry without permission, or change their occupation without their lord's approval. In exchange for living on the Lord's land and receiving protection, they owed labor. A set number of days each week, often 2 to 4 spent working the Lord's fields. Additional days at harvest. Contributions of grain, eggs, and livestock at regular intervals throughout the year. And beyond that, a range of small fees that added up relentlessly. A fee when your daughter married, a fee when you died and your best animal went to the Lord, a fee to use the Lord's mill, the Lord's oven, the Lord's winepress. You arriving with no feudal paperwork, no lord, no village, and no clear legal status, are in a complicated position. You are technically outside the system, which makes you suspicious. Traveling without papers, without a known lord's protection, without a clear purpose. This was the description of a fugitive, a beggar, or a spy. None of these are good things to be in the Middle Ages. The middle-tier free peasants, small tradespeople, craftsmen, and guild towns had considerably more agency. A free man could move, marry, and make contracts without a lord's specific permission. Town charters gave city residents additional protections and rights not available in the countryside. The growing merchant class, by the 13th and 14th centuries, was genuinely wealthy and politically influential. But freedom in the medieval sense came with its own accounting. Without a lord's protection, you arranged your own security. Without a village's common fields, you found your own land. Without a guild's membership, you couldn't practice most skilled trades legally. Society's structures were not optional, you just negotiated which structure you were inside of. And at the very top, the system was elegant in its simplicity. The king owned everything. Everyone else had everything on loan, conditional on service, loyalty, and payment. The word landlord is not a metaphor. The land genuinely belonged to a lord, and everyone on it was there on terms. This was the medieval world's architecture, as normal and unremarkable to its inhabitants as democratic representative government is to us. Just the way things were, complicated, frustrating, occasionally brutal, and genuinely protective in ways that only became clear when it broke down. Let's take a moment to appreciate the food, because medieval cooking was genuinely more interesting than popular myth suggests, and genuinely worse than modern food in specific important ways. The medieval diet was heavily grain-based. Bread was the foundation of every meal at every level of society, from the rough, dark maslin bread of the poorest peasant, made from a mix of wheat, rye, and whatever else was to hand, to the fine white manchet bread of the nobility. Bread was so central that it served as a plate, the trencher, a thick slice of stale bread that absorbed the juices of whatever you served on top of it, and was then either eaten, given to servants, or tossed to the poor at the gate. This is the origin of the term trencher, as a word for a serving plate. Beyond bread, pottage in endlessly variable forms. Legumes, peas, beans, lentils were dietary staples providing protein, and they were eaten boiled, dried in soup, added to bread. Seasonal vegetables when available. Preserved meat and fish in winter, salted, smoked, pickled. Fresh meat was a luxury, usually reserved for feast days, the wealthy and hunters who could supplement their diet. Here's something you'd adapt to quickly: everyone drank ale. Not recreationally, not festively, as a basic daily hydration strategy, the way we drink water. Including children. Including with breakfast. The reason is practical and important. Water sources in and around populated areas were not safe. Without any understanding of germ theory, medieval people couldn't boil or filter water reliably, and the water from urban wells was frequently contaminated by whatever the gong farmers hadn't quite finished removing from the vicinity. Ale made by boiling the grain with water in the process killed the pathogens. Weak ale, small beer, had minimal alcohol content, just enough to be safer than the alternative. Everyone all day on small beer. The Middle Ages had a permanent mild haze of background hydration that was also, incidentally, slightly alcoholic. For you arriving in a medieval city and needing to drink something, the advice is ale. Only ale. The water will ruin your day in ways that dwarf everything else on this list. Medieval noble cuisine is underappreciated. Court kitchens produced extraordinarily elaborate food, stuffed animals rearranged to look alive, spiced wines, sugar sculptures, multi-layered pies with hidden birds that flew out when cut, dishes colored red with sandalwood, yellow with saffron, green with parsley, purple with violets. Pepper, cinnamon, and cloves were worth their weight in silver, which is why trade routes to obtain them drove centuries of exploration. A spice dish wasn't just delicious, it was a display of wealth. The great irony of medieval spice use. We've been taught that spices were used to disguise the taste of rotten meat, but this is almost certainly false. Spices were expensive. You used them to make good food even more impressive, not to rescue bad food. Rotten meat you threw away, or fed to the dogs, or didn't buy in the first place. The spice covers rot story was invented in the 19th century and has been cheerfully repeated since, because it feels true even though it isn't. The thing you've been carefully not thinking about during your medieval day is security. You've been navigating by daylight, staying on the main streets, keeping to yourself. Smart choices. Now the sun is going down. Medieval cities after dark were genuinely dangerous in a way that modern cities are not. There were no police. There were night watchmen in some cities, hired by the municipality, carrying lanterns and ringing bells, but their presence was sparse and their response times were, let's say, variable. If someone decided to relieve you of your coin purse, your cloak, or your life, the person closest to helping you was you. Law enforcement in the medieval sense was largely reactive and community-based. The hue and cry, the system where, if you witnessed a crime, you were legally obligated to shout for help and pursue the criminal with any available neighbors, functioned reasonably well in small villages where everyone knew everyone. In an anonymous city, it was somewhat less effective, particularly at 2 in the morning with no lanterns and a stranger in an alley. If something did go wrong and you ended up entangled with medieval justice, the outcome depended significantly on who you were and who your lord was. Medieval law wasn't random. There were sophisticated legal traditions, trained lawyers, complex court systems. But it was also deeply unequal. A noble accused of a crime faced his peers in a court of other nobles. A peasant accused of theft faced a judge appointed by the very lord he worked for. The system had checks and balances, but the checks and balances were distributed unevenly. Punishments were public and physical. Fines for those who could pay them. Stocks and pillory for humiliating public offenses. Flogging for more serious crimes. Mutilation, a hand removed for repeat theft, at the extreme end of the spectrum. Capital punishment for the most serious crimes, carried out publicly, because the public function of execution was specifically to demonstrate the power of the law through spectacle. If you've ever wondered why medieval punishments feel disproportionately theatrical, that's why. The theater was the point. For you, the advice is the same as it's been throughout. Stay small, stay visible in public spaces, stay near crowds, and absolutely get inside before dark. Every medieval person alive already knows this. You're catching up quickly. One thing that surprises most visitors to the Middle Ages, imaginary ones like us, is the different shape of the day. Without artificial light, human schedules bent toward the natural world in ways we've completely lost. You woke in winter when the cold and dark demanded it. You slept in segments, first sleep and second sleep were the normal vocabulary for the night, with a quiet waking period in between that people used for prayer, conversation, household tasks, or frankly anything they needed privacy for. The idea that a solid 8-hour uninterrupted sleep was the healthy human norm was invented later, possibly when artificial lighting changed nighttime behavior. The medieval night was 2 sleeps with a watch in between, and it was understood that way by everyone. The day was structured around the canonical hours, the bells of the church marking time across the day. Prime at dawn, terce at mid-morning, sext at noon, none in mid-afternoon, vespers at evening, compline before sleep. In a world without clocks or watches, the church bell was the public timepiece. Everything was organized around it: court sessions, market hours, opening and closing of city gates. Not everything about medieval daily life would shock you. The social textures would feel recognizable: people gossiping, complaining about prices, arguing about politics, falling in love, raising children, building careers, nursing grievances, making jokes. Medieval humor was earthy and specific and frequently about exactly what you'd expect given the diet, the medicine, and the sanitation. The fabliaux, short comic tales that circulated across Europe, are the Middle Ages equivalent of a stand-up set, and they're recognizable as jokes despite being nearly 1,000 years old. People found flatulence funny. They found pompous authority figures funny. They found sex funny. Human comedy hasn't evolved that much. Sports and games were popular. Football existed in a form that modern football players might not recognize. It was played between entire villages, had essentially no rules, could last all day, and covered miles of open country. Chess was played and taken seriously at every level of society. Dice games were universal. Tavern culture, with its debates and songs and card games and rounds of ale, was a genuine cornerstone of social life. The medieval world was not a silent, gray, cowed world of constant suffering. It was loud, colorful, contentious, funny, and deeply human. It was also genuinely hard in ways that would exhaust and overwhelm a modern visitor within hours. Both things are true at once, and that's what makes it interesting. In October 1347, 12 Genoese trading ships docked at the port of Messina in Sicily. The harbor master, walking out to meet them, found most of the sailors dead. Those still alive were covered in black swellings the size of eggs, oozing blood and pus from their armpits, groins, and necks. Their skin was covered in black blotches where blood had pooled under the surface. They were burning with fever, delirious, and dying. The harbor master made the correct decision immediately. He ordered the ships out of port. He refused to let anyone disembark. It was too late. The plague, what we now understand to be Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes bubonic plague, had already come ashore. Within days, people in Messina were falling ill. Within weeks, it was spreading north through Italy. Within months, it had crossed the Alps. By 1348, it was in France, Spain, Germany. By 1349, England. By 1350, it had swept the length and breadth of Europe. The Black Death killed somewhere between 30 and 60% of Europe's population. Medieval populations had no immunity, no understanding of germ transmission, and no effective treatment. Physicians bled patients. The church prescribed prayer. The flagellants, groups of men who walked from town to town, whipping themselves publicly as penance, spread the disease further with their movements. Authorities in Venice pioneered the quarantine. Ships arriving in harbor were held for 30 days, then 40, the quarantino, from which the word comes, before their crews were allowed ashore. It helped somewhat. What's striking, reading medieval accounts of the Black Death, is the cognitive dissonance. People understood something catastrophic was happening. Chroniclers wrote with genuine horror. And simultaneously, daily life continued, markets opened, bread was baked, people fell in love and argued about property lines. Humans are extraordinarily good at continuing to function in the middle of the unthinkable, because the alternative is worse. The plague returned. In 1361, the second wave. Then again in the 1370s. And periodically for the next 300 years. It became a background feature of European life, dreaded, familiar, cyclical, and inescapable, like an unwelcome acquaintance who shows up every decade and takes someone you love. Europe recovered eventually. The labor shortage created by so many deaths gave surviving peasants unexpected leverage. They were suddenly valuable, could demand wages, could push back against landlords in ways unimaginable before. Paradoxically, the survivors of the Black Death often lived materially better than their parents had. The catastrophe reshaped the social order in ways that echoed for centuries. When you imagine medieval life, the castle looms large. Gray towers, thick walls, battlements. The great hall with its roaring fire and long tables. Banners and knights and hunting dogs. It's an image drawn from film and novel, and like all such images, it's a simplified version of something considerably more complicated. The great hall of a medieval castle was the nerve center, the place where the lord ate, conducted business, received guests, administered justice, and housed the majority of his household when they weren't at work elsewhere. The long tables were boards placed on trestles, temporary by design, cleared away after meals to make space for sleeping, indoor games, or whatever else was needed. Even in wealthy households, the concept of personal private space was remarkably limited. The hall was communal, noisy, and constantly in use from before dawn until well after dark. Sleeping arrangements for the lord's household ranged from individual chambers for the family to pallets on the hall floor for the servants. Privacy was a luxury of rank. Everyone knew everyone's business, everyone heard everything, and the architecture made solitude essentially impossible for anyone below the family in the social order. Heat was the central challenge. Castles are stone and stone is cold. In winter, even with the great fire blazing in the hall hearth, the outer rooms were frigid. Stone walls absorb and hold cold with the same efficiency with which they hold heat in summer, which is to say, very effectively and persistently. Tapestries on the walls served a function beyond decoration. They were insulation, trapping a thin layer of air between fabric and stone, taking the edge off. The best rooms had multiple fireplaces. The lesser rooms had one shared. The servants' sleeping areas had none. The romance of castle life ignores the substantial labor force required to sustain it. A large noble household employed hundreds of people, stable grooms, kitchen staff, laundresses, chamberlains, stewards, armorers, blacksmiths, gardeners, and a dozen other specializations, whose daily work was the invisible infrastructure that allowed the lord and his family to appear effortlessly magnificent. The kitchen alone was a small factory, operating from before dawn. Fires started, water hauled, animals slaughtered, bread set to prove, soup pots started, pastry made, game birds plucked and prepared. For a feast day, the output might include 50 separate dishes across multiple courses, all timed to arrive at the right temperature in a great hall 50 meters from the kitchen, served by a choreographed staff who knew exactly who sat where and what they were permitted to eat. Medieval feasting was logistics as performance art. Outside the walls, the castle's farms and estates required their own management, the steward overseeing the accounts and labor, the bailiff managing day-to-day agricultural work, the reeve elected from among the peasants to serve as intermediary between the village and the lord's administration. The paperwork, letters, legal documents, financial accounts, was extensive enough that large establishments employed professional scribes full-time. The medieval world ran on documentation. Court records, land surveys, tax rolls, church registers, guild regulations, royal correspondence. The documentary record of the Middle Ages is vast, and it exists because medieval administrations understood that writing things down was how power maintained itself across time and distance. Medieval women occupy an awkward space in popular imagination, either the helpless maiden in a tower waiting for rescue, or the mystical witch on the edge of the village, or the tragic queen sacrificed to dynastic politics. None of these is wrong exactly, but all of them are incomplete. The reality of women's lives in the Middle Ages was as varied as any period, shaped by class, geography, marital status, and individual personality. A noblewoman might have far less legal freedom than a peasant woman married to a freeman. A wealthy merchant's widow could own property, run a business, and navigate courts as an independent legal entity. A guild member's wife often ran the workshop in her husband's absence and took over formally when he died. The abbess of a large monastery governed significant landholdings, supervised dozens of employees, and corresponded with popes and kings as an equal in status, if not in formal hierarchy. The overwhelming majority of medieval women worked. Peasant women worked the fields alongside men during harvest and managed the household economy year-round: the dairy, the garden, the poultry, the preservation of food, the care of children, the spinning and weaving. For most of human history, textile production was an enormous economic activity, and it was overwhelmingly female-organized. Marriage in the Middle Ages was a complex legal institution. The Church defined marriage as a sacrament and insisted that it required the free consent of both parties, a surprisingly progressive position that put the Church into regular conflict with noble families who wanted to arrange their children's marriages for political and financial advantage. In practice, consent meant different things to different people, and economic pressure on a 17-year-old to agree to what her family had negotiated was not considered coercion in the modern sense. Within marriage, women's legal position varied. In England, common law doctrine of coverture meant that a married woman's legal identity merged with her husband's. She couldn't own property independently, enter contracts, or sue in her own name. But this was not universal across Europe, and it was far less absolute in practice than in theory. Widowhood was often when women's legal position strengthened considerably. A widow had full legal personhood, could own and manage property, and had authority over her household that she'd never had as a daughter or wife. Medicine for women included the full range of medieval healthcare options, plus female-specific practitioners, the midwife, who managed childbirth risky by any historical standard, and various traditional healers, many of them women, whose herbal and experiential knowledge was the main healthcare resource for most communities outside the reach of university-trained physicians. Childbirth was the central health risk for medieval women, and it was managed by female networks almost entirely. Male physicians were called for extraordinary emergencies. For normal childbirth, and there was a great deal of normal childbirth, the chamber was female only, the midwife experienced female neighbors, the expectant mother's close female relatives. The Church excluded men from the birthing room not from prudishness, but because the room was considered simultaneously to belong to the women managing it and to be theologically dangerous if things went wrong. The practical effect was a female-managed space with real accumulated expertise, operating independently of male professional medicine. The medieval Church is hard to understand in modern terms because nothing quite like it exists today. It was simultaneously the largest employer in Europe, the biggest landowner in most countries, the primary provider of education and healthcare, the keeper of official records, the source of cultural life, and the framework within which most people understood their existence, their obligations, and their place in the universe. The parish church was the community center. Announcements were made from the pulpit: news, royal decrees, local law, practical information. The churchyard was where the community gathered, where children played, where negotiations happened, where gossip was exchanged. Fairs and markets clustered around church festivals because that's when people gathered. The liturgical calendar structured the year. Feast days, fast days, saints' days, the great seasonal pivots of Christmas, Easter, midsummer. Medieval faith was not primarily about theology, that was for scholars. For ordinary people, it was a practice. The daily routine of small prayers, the regular attendance at Mass, the veneration of local saints whose shrines dotted the countryside, the wearing of small medals and tokens that served as both expression of faith and practical protection. Saints were the Middle Ages specialists. Saint Apollonia for toothaches. Saint Sebastian for plague. Saint Christopher for travelers. Saint Erasmus for stomach ailments. Each had a specific competence, a specific feast day, and a specific iconography. To pray to a saint was to engage a specialist rather than approaching God directly, a more manageable ask somehow for the specific anxieties of daily life. Pilgrimage was the era's defining travel experience. The journey to a saint's shrine, to ask for intercession, to fulfill a vow, to seek a cure, or simply to demonstrate faith through physical hardship. Canterbury, Santiago de Compostela, Rome, Jerusalem. The pilgrim routes were the motorways of the medieval world, maintained, staffed with inns and hospitals, patrolled against bandits, traversed by thousands annually. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales are set on such a journey, and the pilgrims he describes, the knight, the wife of Bath, the pardoner, the prioress, are recognizably human in every detail despite 8 centuries of separation. The church also meant power, corruption, and regular scandal. The selling of indulgences, payments to reduce time in purgatory, was a permanent source of controversy. The gap between monastic ideals and monastic practice was noted, mocked, and complained about endlessly. Chaucer's corrupt pardoner and slovenly monk were recognizable satirical targets precisely because the originals existed and everyone knew it. Reform movements arose periodically: the Franciscans and Dominicans in the 13th century, the Lollards in England, the Hussites in Bohemia, arguing for a simpler, more austere, more scripturally grounded faith. The church absorbed most of them, marginalized some, and burned a few. The tension between institutional authority and individual conscience that would eventually produce the Reformation was already present and visible. There is something almost impressive about a conflict so comprehensively misnamed. The 100 Years' War between England and France lasted, depending on how you count it, from 1337 to 1453. That's 116 years, at which point even the most optimistic medieval person would have stopped calling it a temporary disagreement and accepted that this was just the new normal. The war began, as European wars often did, with a property dispute that escalated. The English King Edward III claimed the French throne through his mother, a claim that French lawyers and the French aristocracy considered both technically valid under some interpretations of inheritance law and completely unacceptable under the interpretation that mattered most, which was their own. France had a king. France did not need an English one. The disagreement about this point occupied armies, diplomats, assassins, and an enormous amount of everyone's tax money for over a century. The war produced some of history's most famous battles. At Crécy in 1346, a smaller English army faced a much larger French one on a hillside, and the English longbowmen, yeoman soldiers who trained from childhood and could loose 10 to 12 arrows per minute at targets hundreds of yards away, destroyed the elite French cavalry so thoroughly that the French lost perhaps 4,000 knights and the English lost perhaps 100. Medieval military history turns on this kind of reversal, when a new technology or tactic meets an army still fighting the last war. Agincourt in 1415 was the same formula, even more dramatically. Henry V of England, with perhaps 6,000 men, many of them sick, all of them exhausted from a long march, faced a French army of somewhere between 12 and 30,000, depending on which source you consult. The French knights encased in expensive plate armor were the finest military force in Europe. The English longbowmen were commoners. The French cavalry charged across a field that had been recently plowed and soaked by autumn rain, which turned under thousands of hooves into something between mud and porridge. The armored knights sank. When they fell, they couldn't get back up. Their armor weighed 60 to 80 pounds and required assistance to stand in. They lay in the mud, unable to rise, and were killed by English soldiers with knives who found the gaps in the armor and finished the work the arrows had started. The battle lasted perhaps 3 hours. The English lost perhaps 400 men. The French lost perhaps 6,000, including most of their aristocracy. The psychological impact was incalculable. France had been reduced in the space of an afternoon from the dominant military power in Europe to a nation in existential crisis. It would take a 17-year-old girl from a village in eastern France to begin putting it back together. Joan of Arc is one of history's strangest and most compelling figures, and she is difficult to fit into any comfortable modern narrative. She was 17 when she appeared at the French court, claiming to have received visions from Saints Catherine, Margaret, and Michael, directing her to lead the French army and crown the uncrowned French king at Reims. She was illiterate. She was a peasant girl. She had no military training. She was given armor and an army. What followed the raising of the siege of Orleans, the march to Reims, the coronation of Charles VII happened in roughly 9 months. Joan gave the French something they had almost completely lost, the belief that they could win. The practical military results were real. The psychological effect was larger. The English had, through a series of catastrophically bad diplomatic decisions, managed to alienate most of the population of northern France over the years of occupation. Joan gave the resistance a symbol, and symbols move armies when logistics can't. She was captured by Burgundian allies of the English in 1430, tried by a church tribunal on charges of heresy and wearing men's clothing, found guilty, and burned at the stake in Rouen in May 1431. She was 19 years old. 25 years later, after the war ended and France had won, the church reopened the case and posthumously acquitted her. In 1920, she was canonized. She is now a saint and one of France's national symbols. The English who had her killed and the church, which did the killing, are perhaps understandably less featured in the French national mythology of this period. History is written by the survivors, which in this case meant France. The fact that England lost the 100 Years' War, ultimately keeping only Calais of all their French territory, is rarely featured prominently in English history classes. Another thing we share with medieval people, a selective relationship with national memory. In 1095, Pope Urban II stood up at the Council of Clermont in France and gave one of history's most consequential speeches. The details of what exactly he said are somewhat unclear because we have several different written accounts from several different chroniclers, none of whom seem to have had the same transcript. But the gist was clear. The holy city of Jerusalem, the place where Christ walked and died and rose, was in the hands of people who weren't Christian, and they were persecuting pilgrims, and the warriors of Europe should stop killing each other for 5 minutes and go fix this. The response was somewhat beyond what anyone anticipated. The crowd shouted "God wills it," so loudly and enthusiastically that Urban reportedly had to call for quiet. Knights across France and the Holy Roman Empire began selling estates, saying farewell to families, and attaching crosses to their cloaks. The First Crusade was underway. The People's Crusade, a ragged, ill-supplied mass movement of ordinary people who set off before the knights arrived, reached the Byzantine Empire, raided some of their allies' territory for food along the way, and was essentially destroyed by the Seljuk Turks in Anatolia before it ever reached Jerusalem. This was not an encouraging preview. The main army arrived in the spring of 1097, having covered roughly 3,000 miles, and began the slow, brutal campaign across Anatolia and down through Syria toward the ultimate goal. Medieval armies didn't travel fast. They traveled at the pace of the slowest supply wagon, which in difficult terrain meant perhaps 10 to 15 miles on a good day. The journey from northern France to Jerusalem took the better part of 2 years for many participants. The siege of Jerusalem in 1099 was medieval warfare at its most extreme. The city's Muslim and Jewish defenders had some warning and had expelled their Christian population. They didn't want potential fifth columns inside the walls and prepared for a siege they knew was coming. The Crusaders arrived in June and surrounded the city. The temperature in Jerusalem in June is well above 30 degrees. They had very little water. They had run low on food during the long campaign. Their siege equipment had been mostly destroyed or left behind. They were exhausted, malnourished, and under-equipped. They tried one assault on the walls and were driven back. A hermit on the Mount of Olives told them to fast and march barefoot around the walls like Joshua at Jericho, and then attack. They did. On July 15, 1099, the walls were breached. The city was taken. What followed was a massacre that medieval sources recorded with a frankness that is hard to read. The Jewish community sheltered in their synagogue, which was burned. The Muslim population was killed or sold into slavery. The streets, according to several accounts, ran with blood. This was war in the medieval world, total, without quarter, using an enemy city's population as both trophy and warning. The Crusaders established the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which lasted until 1187, when Saladin, Sultan of Egypt and Syria, destroyed the Crusader army at the Horns of Hattin and retook the city. Unlike the 1099 conquest, Saladin's retaking of Jerusalem was notably measured. Most of the Christian population was allowed to leave, and the city was not destroyed. The contrast was noted at the time, and not always in the Crusaders' favor. The subsequent Crusades, there were 8 major ones, plus various smaller campaigns over the next 2 centuries, achieved varying degrees of the original goal and introduced various unintended consequences. The Fourth Crusade in 1202 famously never reached the Holy Land at all. It got rerouted through a complicated series of events involving Venetian shipping contracts, Byzantine succession politics, and the general human tendency to prioritize what's convenient over what was intended, to Constantinople, the Christian capital of the Byzantine Empire, which the Crusaders sacked in 1204. They looted the greatest city in the Christian world, stole its greatest treasures, and installed their own Latin emperor. The Byzantines never fully recovered. The weakened empire limped on until 1453, when the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II finally took the city, renamed it Istanbul, and converted the Hagia Sophia into a mosque. The Crusaders, in trying to defend Christian civilization from Islam, had managed to fatally damage Christian civilization's eastern headquarters. History rarely cooperates with intentions. What the Crusades did achieve, arguably, was a massive increase in cultural exchange between Europe and the Islamic world. Arab medicine, mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, and technology flowed westward through trade routes, returning crusaders and translated manuscripts. The intellectual revolution of the 12th and 13th centuries in Europe, the rise of universities, the rediscovery of Greek philosophy through Arabic translations, the development of scholasticism, was significantly fueled by contact with a civilization that had preserved and advanced ancient learning, while Europe had been managing its own post-Roman reconstruction. If you want to understand the Middle Ages, sooner or later you have to understand the monastery. Not just as a religious institution, but as a technology, a social technology specifically, for accumulating and preserving knowledge, organizing labor, managing land, and projecting institutional continuity across generations in a world where everything else was profoundly uncertain. A large monastery in the 12th century was simultaneously a farm, a school, a hospital, a library, a workshop, a hotel for travelers, a bank for the local economy, and a center of artistic production. The monks who staffed it had taken vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Personally, they owned nothing. Institutionally, the monastery might own thousands of acres and employ hundreds of workers. The scriptorium was where manuscripts were copied and created. Before the printing press, every book in existence was handwritten, on expensive vellum made from animal skin, requiring enormous labor. A Bible might take a professional scribe a full year to copy. The illustrations in illuminated manuscripts, the intricate decorated capitals, the miniature paintings in the margins, the gold leaf that still shines in museums almost 1,000 years later, represented hundreds of hours of specialized skilled labor. The monks who produced these were craftsmen and artists of the highest order, working in service of faith but creating, incidentally, some of the most beautiful objects human hands have ever made. Monastic life was structured, rigorous, and genuinely demanding in ways that make modern office work look leisurely. The divine office, the 8 canonical prayer services that divided the day, began at midnight with matins, continued at lauds at dawn, then prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline before bed. That's 8 prayer services distributed across a 24-hour period. Between them, manual labor, reading, and study. The balance between prayer, work, and reading was specified in the Rule of Saint Benedict, the 6th century document that governed most Western monasteries, with the precision of a management handbook. The rule is, in many ways, remarkable. It's humane by the standards of its time. Benedict explicitly adjusts the demands for the old, the sick, and the young, recommends adequate food and sleep, and instructs abbots to govern with wisdom and compassion rather than severity. It also specifies the exact amount of wine permitted per day, roughly half a pint, with the provision that in climates where wine isn't naturally available, the monks should not be distressed about this, and the process for admitting new members, including a year-long probationary period where they were allowed to leave if they changed their mind. The monastery garden was the medieval world's research institution. Herb gardens systematically cultivated medicinal plants. Fish ponds managed protein supply. Orchards were carefully tended. Agricultural techniques developed in monasteries, improved varieties, drainage systems, crop rotation experiments spread to the surrounding countryside. The economic output of a well-run monastery was enormous, and the surplus was redistributed through hospitality, charity, and the various services monasteries provided to the local community. The preservation of classical learning through the monastic libraries is one of history's great quiet accomplishments. When the Western Roman Empire fell and the structures that had supported literate culture collapsed, the monasteries provided a refugium, a place where texts could survive, be copied, be studied, and eventually be transmitted to the world that would eventually want them. Virgil and Cicero, Pliny and Ovid, Aristotle in Latin translation, the Church Fathers, all of these survived the chaos of the early medieval period in monastery libraries. The monks who copied them were often not copying secular literature out of secular interest, but because copying was a spiritual discipline, and anything available to be copied was available to be read, and anything readable had educational value. The inadvertent preservation of half of classical antiquity happened largely in the margins of an institution focused on something entirely different. The 12th and 13th centuries, when contact with the Arab world reconnected Europe with classical learning it had forgotten, saw a surge of activity in university towns, Paris, Bologna, Oxford, Cambridge, and the monasteries fed that surge with their accumulated centuries of careful stewardship. When scholars wanted Aristotle in the original, or Euclid, or Galen, it was the monastery libraries that had them. History doesn't always reward the right people, but in this case, the monasteries get appropriate credit. They kept the lights on. The word Viking has a strange history. In Old Norse, it referred to a specific activity, going on a raid, going a Viking, not a people. The people we call Vikings were Scandinavians, Norwegians, Danes, and Swedes during a particular era, roughly 793 to 1066, when they ranged across an extraordinary territory in ways that terrified some people, enriched others, and permanently changed the geography of the medieval world. They were not the horn-helmeted savages of popular imagination. Helmet horns are a romantic 19th century invention, added by opera designers who thought the look would be impressive. Real Viking helmets were simple iron or leather affairs designed to protect the head from swords, not to broadcast a terrifying aesthetic. Similarly, the image of the brutal Viking raider is one side of a much more complicated story. The same people who raided monasteries in Ireland also founded Dublin. The same culture that produced berserker warriors also produced intricate silver jewelry, sophisticated legal codes, and some of the world's great early literature. The Vikings were, first and fundamentally, traders. Before they were raiders, they were merchants. The longship, that marvel of Scandinavian shipbuilding, capable of crossing the Atlantic and also of sailing up shallow rivers, was a commercial vehicle as much as a warship. The same design that allowed a raiding party to beach directly on a shore and retreat quickly could also deliver trade goods to river markets deep in the interior of Russia. The same men who raided monasteries in England were importing silver from the Islamic world through eastern trade routes that ran from the Baltic to the Caspian Sea. The geographical range of Viking activity is staggering when you see it laid out. From their Scandinavian homelands, they went east along rivers into what would become Russia. The name Russia may derive from the Rus, a Scandinavian people who established trading towns along the Volga and Dnieper rivers. They reached Constantinople and entered the service of the Byzantine emperors as elite soldiers. The Varangian Guard, the emperor's personal bodyguard, was composed of Norse warriors who were valued precisely because they had no local political allegiances. They settled Iceland, which had no permanent human inhabitants before the Norse arrived in the 870s. From Iceland they colonized Greenland, and from Greenland, around 1000 AD, 500 years before Columbus, they reached North America. Leif Erikson and his crew explored a coast they called Vinland, which appears to correspond to the northern tip of Newfoundland, where archaeologists have found a genuine Norse settlement at Elance Ox Meadows. They met indigenous people they called Skraelings, had violent encounters that persuaded them not to stay, and went home. The first European contact with the Americas ended not in conquest but in retreat. They went south to France. The Normans of Normandy were Norse settlers whose name literally means Northmen, and from there, 2 generations later, conquered England in 1066 under William the Conqueror, himself a descendant of the Viking chief Rollo who had settled Normandy a century and a half earlier. The Norman conquest of England is, in a real sense, a Viking story. They raided Ireland so persistently that Irish monks began praying specifically for bad weather, since Vikings didn't sail well in storms. They established trading settlements that became the cities of Dublin, Limerick, and Waterford. They raided deep into the Mediterranean, reached North Africa, and attacked cities in what is now Spain, Portugal, and Morocco. The Islamic world knew them as the Rus, or sometimes simply as the people in the boats who appeared without warning and wanted things. The Viking Age ended not with a military defeat, but with a cultural transformation. Christianity spread into Scandinavia during the 10th and 11th centuries, and with it came the social structures of feudal Europe: monasteries, cathedrals, written legal codes, and the administrative infrastructure that made large, settled societies function. The same energy and organizational capacity that had powered the raids was redirected into state building. By the mid-11th century, the Scandinavian kingdoms were fully Christian, fully feudalized, and fully integrated into European political life. Their kings fought wars with other European kings, married European princesses, and had themselves represented by illuminated manuscripts in the style of the continental courts. What made them different from other Europeans was increasingly a matter of geography and economics, not culture and religion. The raids didn't stop entirely. There were Norwegian expeditions in the 12th century, and Scandinavian pirates were an issue in the Baltic for centuries. But the Viking Age as a specific phenomenon of longships, monastery raids, and explosive geographical expansion was over. What remained was the legacy. The Norman kingdoms in England and Sicily, the city of Dublin, the trade routes across Russia, the Norse discovery of America, and a mythological tradition so rich and vivid that it is still producing best-selling novels and blockbuster films 1,000 years later. When medieval people used pepper, they were touching a thread that ran back through a network of traders, middlemen, sailors, and camel drivers stretching from the spice markets of Southeast Asia, through India, across the Persian Gulf or the Red Sea, overland through the Islamic world, and finally to the docks of Venice or Genoa. The spice trade was the medieval world's most globalized industry, and its profits funded Renaissance art. The Silk Road, which is really a network of roads, sea routes, and river systems rather than a single road, had been connecting China to the Mediterranean since antiquity. By the medieval period it was in full operation, moving silk, spices, precious metals, glass, horses, and ideas in both directions. The Black Death, it's worth noting, probably traveled westward along the Silk Road in the 1340s, carried by fleas on rats in the cargo of merchant ships, the most devastating unintended consequence of commerce in history. The Islamic world sat at the center of this network, and for much of the medieval period, it was the most commercially sophisticated and urbanized civilization on earth. Baghdad, Cairo, and Constantinople were great cities. London and Paris were overgrown market towns by comparison. The translations of Greek philosophy, mathematics, and science that fueled the European intellectual renaissance of the 12th century traveled along the same routes as silk and pepper, carried in the libraries of traveling scholars and the collections of wealthy patrons who understood that ideas like spices were worth importing. The Hanseatic League deserves more fame than it typically gets in popular history. It was a commercial confederation of trading cities around the North Sea and Baltic, at its peak, over 200 cities, that operated from roughly 1241 to 1669 as one of the most successful economic projects in European history. With no central government, no standing army, and no legal existence as a formal state, the Hands enforced contracts, maintained trade routes, standardized weights and measures, and wielded enough collective economic power to go to war with Denmark and win. The League's genius was straightforward. Trading cities had common interests, and common interests could be protected by collective action even without a central authority. Member cities shared market access, coordinated price setting, enforced quality standards, and boycotted any partner city that violated the terms. The boycott, the economic weapon of refusing to trade, was the League's nuclear option, and it worked. Cities that found themselves cut off from Hanseatic markets lost business so dramatically that they almost always capitulated. The Hanseatic trading offices established in foreign cities like London, Bergen, Bruges, and Novgorod functioned as self-contained commercial enclaves, with their own laws, their own courts, their own dormitories for traveling merchants, and their own rules about interaction with the local population. The Steelyard in London, the Hanseatic trading post in operation from the 13th century until 1598, was for much of that period the most important commercial address in the city. European commerce needed more than physical goods and trading routes. It needed money in forms that could travel without being robbed, could cross borders without being minted again at each crossing, and could accumulate to the scale needed to finance large-scale enterprises. Medieval Italian bankers, primarily from Florence, Siena, and Genoa, invented the financial infrastructure that made this possible. The bill of exchange, a promissory note that could be bought in one city and redeemed in another, was essentially a check. You deposited money with a Florentine banking house in London, received a bill of exchange, traveled to Florence with a light piece of paper instead of heavy coinage, and redeemed it there. The banking house took a cut, but you arrived intact. The Knights Templar had pioneered a version of this system for pilgrims. The Italian banks perfected and commercialized it. Double-entry bookkeeping, the accounting system where every transaction is recorded twice, as a debit and a credit, so that errors are immediately apparent, was developed by Italian merchants in the 13th and 14th centuries. It sounds dry, but it was revolutionary. It made fraud detectable, made complex business structures manageable, and made it possible to understand a large enterprise's financial position at any given moment. Luca Pacioli formalized the system in 1494, and it is essentially unchanged today. Every accounting software in the world runs on a system invented by medieval Italian merchants. The Medici Bank, founded in 1397, became the most powerful financial institution in Europe by the mid-15th century, banker to popes, lender to kings, patron of artists, and political force in Florence. The art and architecture of the Italian Renaissance was, in significant part, funded by the profits of medieval commercial innovation. One of the most reliable ways to close the distance between yourself and people from another century is to read what they found funny. Medieval humor is, by turns, familiar and alien, and the mix is revealing. The fabliaux, short comic tales in verse that circulated across France, England, and beyond from the 12th to the 14th centuries, are the Middle Ages comedy circuit. They are, by modern content standards, extremely frank. The great subjects are adultery, flatulence, bodily functions, stupid husbands, clever wives, greedy clergy, and the general humiliations that come from bodies being bodies. Geoffrey Chaucer borrowed from them liberally. The Miller's Tale and the Reeve's Tale in the Canterbury Tales are fabliaux in all but name. What's striking is how familiar the comic mechanisms are. Set-up, subversion of expectation, punchline, the structure hasn't changed. The targets are, with adjustments for period, the same. Authority figures whose pretensions exceed their competence, people whose dignity is undermined by physical reality, the complications that arise from the gap between what people claim to want and what they actually pursue. The bishop who turns out to be a hypocrite, the knight whose courage fails when it matters, the scholar whose learning doesn't protect him from romantic humiliation, these are perennial. Medieval audiences laughed at them for the same reason every audience before and after has laughed at them. Medieval culture had a formalized tradition of periodic misrule, designated days when the normal social order was temporarily inverted, when the low became high and the high became ridiculous. The Feast of Fools, celebrated in some regions around the New Year, saw junior clergy performing a mock mass, electing a boy bishop or a pope of fools, and generally using religious ceremony as the vehicle for comedy that the rest of the year was not allowed. The Church repeatedly tried to suppress these celebrations and largely failed, which tells you something about how important the pressure valve function was. Carnival, the season of excess immediately before Lent, served the same function at a broader social level. The name may derive from carn vale, farewell to meat, but the practice was about far more than food. It was a licensed period of disorder, of the body's claims over the spirits, of mockery of everything that was usually sacred. Masks meant anonymity, and anonymity meant license. What was said in the public carnival square might be actionable said by an identified person in the middle of a Tuesday, said behind a mask by a crowd, it became uncatchable. Mikhail Bakhtin, the 20th century Russian literary theorist, wrote about the carnivalesque, this tradition of official, temporary inversion, as a fundamental feature of medieval popular culture. The argument is that these periods of licensed transgression didn't undermine social order. They sustained it, providing the release that made the constraints of the rest of the year bearable. Whether or not you accept the theoretical framework, the historical observation is clearly correct. Medieval authorities tolerated a great deal of publicly expressed irreverence during these designated seasons that they would have punished at any other time. Medieval entertainment was heavily physical and visual. Traveling troops of jugglers, acrobats, animal trainers, and storytellers moved between towns and fairs, offering performance as a commodity. The trained animal was a medieval staple: bears, monkeys, horses, whose appeal came partly from spectacle and partly from the comedy of an animal doing something recognizably human. The bear dancing clumsily to music, the dog that sorted colored blocks, the monkey that mimicked human movements. These attracted crowds for the same reason that animals in human contexts still make people laugh. The court jester, in some courts a permanent household position, in others a role filled by visiting entertainers, had a specific cultural function beyond entertainment. The jester could say things that no one else could say, including uncomfortable truths about the patron. The protection of the fool's role, the implicit social contract that the jester was not serious, was only joking, should not be held to account, created a space for criticism and honesty that was otherwise unavailable. A king could laugh at himself through the jester, in a way that preserved dignity while acknowledging the joke. Whether this actually worked in practice depended entirely on the individual king and the individual jester. Several historical jesters died for saying the wrong funny thing at the wrong moment. The margin for error was narrow. Medieval people were not dour, pious, and silent. They were loud, funny, argumentative, and frequently off-color. They made jokes about exactly what you'd expect them to make jokes about. They attended performances, told stories, played games, drank ale, danced at festivals, and complained about the weather and the cost of things. The distance between medieval daily life and our own is real and significant, but across that distance, the sound of laughter is continuous. The university is a medieval invention. This is easy to overlook because the institution is so familiar that it feels like it must have always existed. But the university, a self-governing community of scholars with defined curricula, degree-granting authority, and legal recognition, emerged specifically in 12th and 13th century Europe, and nowhere else first. Bologna in northern Italy claims the oldest university in the world, with origins in the teaching of law that coalesced into a formal institution around 1088. The University of Paris followed in the late 12th century, becoming the preeminent center of theology and philosophy in Europe. Oxford and Cambridge appeared in England shortly after. Salamanca, Padua, Naples, Montpellier. By 1300, there were a dozen universities across Europe, and by 1500, nearly 100. The origin story is messy, as most origin stories are. Medieval universities grew out of cathedral schools, the educational institutions attached to major cathedrals, which had been the primary centers of learning since the early medieval period. As these schools attracted more students and more specialized teachers, they began to formalize. Creating guilds of scholars, the word university meant a guild, a community, before it meant an institution of higher learning, negotiating with local authorities for legal protections, and defining what exactly a student needed to learn before being awarded a degree. The early university experience was considerably less comfortable than the modern version. Students arrived as young as 14 or 15, found lodgings in private houses or student halls, and attended lectures in whatever rooms were available, often rented church buildings or market halls. There was no campus in the modern sense. The university was an organizational structure, not a place. The medieval curriculum was organized into two programs. The trivium, grammar, rhetoric, and logic, was the foundation. The quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, was the more advanced study. Together these formed the liberal arts, the education appropriate for a free person, which in the medieval context meant someone destined for intellectual or administrative life rather than manual labor. Beyond the liberal arts were the professional faculties: theology, the queen of the sciences, the highest study; law, in great demand from a world increasingly organized around written legal documents; and medicine, using Galen and Avicenna mostly. A Master of Arts degree took roughly 6 years. A doctorate in theology could take 15 years or more. The medieval PhD was not a rush to job market credential. The preferred teaching method was the lecture the master read from a text, commenting as he went, students taking notes. The word lecture comes from the Latin for reading because that's literally what it was. But the distinctive intellectual technology of the medieval university was the disputation, a formal public debate in which positions were stated, objections were raised, and responses were required, all according to strict logical protocols. The disputatio was a competitive sport, an intellectual workout, and a method of teaching critical thinking simultaneously. A student who couldn't defend a thesis against skilled objectors had simply not learned the material. Thomas Aquinas, the great Dominican theologian whose Summa Theologica attempted a complete synthesis of Christian theology and Aristotelian philosophy, was a product and teacher of this system. His method, raise an objection, consider it seriously, then refute it, is the disputation format written into prose. The Summa covers hundreds of questions, from whether God exists to whether angels occupy space, each addressed with the same systematic rigor. It's an extraordinary document, and it's also the longest argument in favor of the scholastic method ever produced, because its existence is proof that the method worked. Medieval students were, by all available evidence, recognizably students. They complained about money, argued with their landlords, formed friendships that lasted their whole lives, fell into debt, occasionally fought in the streets, and discovered that the gap between the idealized pursuit of knowledge and the practical reality of studying in cold rooms in unfamiliar cities could be quite wide. University regulations spent a great deal of time on student behavior, which tells you something about what that behavior tended to be. Prohibitions on keeping weapons, brawling in the streets, attending prostitutes, and playing dice appear in the statutes of multiple medieval universities. The conflict between town and gown, the university community and the local population, was a recurring feature of medieval university life, occasionally erupting into genuine violence. The St. Scholastica Day riot in Oxford in 1355, which grew from a dispute in a tavern over the quality of the wine and eventually killed around 60 people, was the worst but not the only such event. The formal channels for student grievance were limited, which led to the informal channel, leaving. Medieval students had genuine mobility. If a teacher was poor, or the town made life unpleasant, or the local bishop cracked down on something the students valued, they could and did pack up and move to another city. The University of Cambridge was founded partly by scholars who had left Oxford following exactly this kind of conflict. Competition among universities for students and teachers was real, and it kept institutions responsive to the community they served in ways that might surprise us. Medieval music is one of history's more surprising treasures. We have substantial bodies of surviving notation from the 9th century onwards, the earliest surviving Western written music, and what it reveals, once you hear it performed by modern specialists, is strikingly beautiful, strange, and sometimes unexpectedly modern. The music of the medieval church, Gregorian chant, named after Pope Gregory, although almost certainly not composed by him, is the monophonic tradition. Single melodic lines, no harmony, designed to move through the large stone spaces of a cathedral in ways that create a meditative, reverent atmosphere. Listening to plain chant in a cathedral is one of the most effective time travel experiences available without actual time travel. The acoustics were designed for this music, and the music was designed for these acoustics. By the 12th and 13th centuries, polyphony, multiple voices singing different but harmonically related lines simultaneously, was developing rapidly. The Notre Dame School in Paris, associated with composers Léonin and Pérotin, produced organum, extended compositions in which a long-held tenor note sustained below while upper voices sang elaborate decorative passages above it. If you've ever heard Pérotin's Vidrant Omnes, you'll know that it sounds nothing like what you might expect from a document 800 years old. It sounds like something a contemporary composer might write for a modern ensemble, because it is both deeply structured and genuinely surprising. Alongside the church's music ran the secular tradition. Troubadours in southern France, trouvers in the north, minnesingers in the German-speaking world, poet-composers, often of noble birth, who created a sophisticated lyric tradition centered on themes of love, loyalty, loss, and occasionally politics. The troubadour tradition is where the Western concept of romantic love in its modern form largely originates. The idea that love ennobles the lover, that it involves idealization of the beloved, that the pursuit and expression of love is valuable in itself, regardless of its outcome. This was a cultural invention, not a human universal. People had been falling in love for as long as people had existed, but the particular narrative framework, the elaborate system of courtly love, with its conventions about how a knight should address and pursue a lady, what she owed him in terms of encouragement, what emotional states the experience was supposed to produce, was assembled specifically by 12th-century Occitan poets and disseminated through an astonishing network of courts and literary patronage. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most remarkable individuals of the 12th century, was instrumental in spreading this culture. As Queen first of France, then of England, she brought troubadour culture to courts that had not previously had it, patronized poets and musicians, and participated personally in the intellectual life of the tradition. Her court at Poitiers became a center of literary and artistic culture that attracted talent from across Europe. The daughters she raised, including Marie de Champagne, who commissioned Chrétien de Troyes to write the first Arthurian romances featuring Lancelot, propagated the culture further. A tradition that began in the castles of Provence ended up defining the Western narrative of romantic love for 8 centuries. The great medieval cathedrals are, by any honest assessment, among the most extraordinary things human beings have ever built. Notre Dame in Paris, Chartres, Salisbury, Cologne, Santiago de Compostela, their scale, their technical ambition, and their endurance defy easy explanation. These are buildings constructed without power tools, without modern engineering calculations, by people who learned their trade through apprenticeship and worked out structural problems by building small models and seeing what failed. When something failed at full scale, and things did fail, several medieval cathedral towers and roofs collapsed. The builders incorporated what they'd learned and tried again. The flying buttress, one of Gothic architecture's most distinctive features, was developed specifically to solve the problem of stone walls that were becoming dangerously thin as cathedral designers pushed for ever more height and ever more light. The light was the point. Gothic architecture is an engineering project in service of light.